Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Veg Grower Podcast. My name's Richard and I want to encourage and inspire you to grow more of your own food. And I do this by sharing what's been going on in my own allotment and my own garden. Now you might hear that it's quite a bit noisy down on the allotment today, and here we are just a couple of days into spring. And I've got to say, so far spring has been rather lovely. I know, just a couple of days into spring, towards the last third of March, but the weather has been pretty good the last few days. We've had some nice sunny weather. Today it is a little bit on the windy side, but at least it is dry. And I've came down the allotment because I had a few tasks that I wanted to tackle. The first task was, of course, cutting the grass, and I have been mentioning about cutting the grass over the last couple of weeks because that's one of those jobs that I think pays off to try and do regularly and keep on top of it, and that's something that I certainly do at least once a week. At the moment I'm cutting the grass when it is dry, of course. It's one of the advantages of it being dry. Now I have had to make a couple of changes with the cutting grass task. The main reason being, over the last couple of weeks I haven't been able to strim the grass before I cut it, and the reason for that is that my strimmer had actually run out of strimmer line, and what I normally do is just buy a reel of strimmer line, and when I run out I just feed that in, and it's really easy to get the strimmer up and working. Well, I kept forgetting to do that, and when I was on the allotment last week and realised I'd forgotten it, I quickly went on to Amazon and just ordered 3 ready rolled strimmer pieces that literally just slot into my strimmer and off we go. Well, I came down to the allotment today and I did that. I literally just got this strimmer reel, popped it in, and within a few minutes I was good to go. And I actually thought that makes life so much easier in order to just get on with the job and changing the strimmer line, rather than trying to feed in a load of reel and wrap it round the reel piece. The other thing I noticed is that when I stop using my strimmer and I restart it, the strimmer line actually extends. And when I've wrapped it up my own way, that doesn't happen so much. Well, by buying a strimmer reel and just popping that in, it seems to work as it should. So I think in the future that's what I'm going to do. There's not much money in it, to be honest. It is a little wasteful for my liking, but I think there might be a way we can recycle a strimmer reel piece, perhaps get it melted down to use for 3D printing. Anyway, beyond that, we also had to use a new battery in the lawnmower. Last couple of weeks I've been using my lawnmower quite happy, but my high-powered 5 amp hour batteries were starting to struggle a bit. They are getting old and overused, shall we say. So again, on Amazon I managed to get hold of some 8 amp hour ryobi batteries, and I've brought those down to the allotment, plugged one in, and I've done the whole allotment without any fuss on one battery. So I'm very happy with that. I've got to say, it is a bit heavier battery, but more power, longer lasting, and it's done the job much better. So lesson learned. I think once a year I'm going to have to buy some new batteries for my battery powered tools. Not a huge problem. They're not that expensive in the grand scheme of things, and we can use them on the allotment and back at home. So with the grass cut, I then turned my attention to my garlic. Now my garlic has been growing over winter quite nicely, and it looks like we are getting some decent garlic. Some varieties haven't done as well as the other varieties. We have 4 different varieties here on the allotment, but we're not too fussed by that. That's swings and roundabouts. We'll just monitor it and see how it gets on. But what I had to do is just give it a bit of a quick weeding to try and remove any weeds. And then we are getting some of the tips of the foliage just yellow a bit. Now that's not unusual. Over winter it gets cold, yellow garlic tips can get a bit frostbitten. So we're not surprised by that. But it can also be a sign that the plant needs feeding. So I got my garlic fertiliser out my shed and I sprinkled that over my garlic. And then I followed that up with a good watering. Now I've noticed that we haven't had rain for a few weeks. We have had windy weather, we have had sunshine, and the top of our soil just looks a little bit dry. So I figured giving the garlic a good watering was just going to be a good thing. When I've dug down the soil, which is something to come up later on, the actual soil is moist when we get down a couple of centimetres, but certainly the top was looking a bit dry. So I gave my garlic a watering. I've also watered in the potatoes that I planted out last week. Now that I have watered these areas, I suspect it is going to rain and rain hard, but never mind that, we've got it done. It's going to help. It's going to go a long way in helping our plants grow. And I always think, you know what? Water is free. It comes from the sky. If we use it to produce plants, then that can only be a good thing. If we use it to produce food and we try and use it when we need it, then that can only be a good thing. Of course, as we move on, we may have to mulch our garlic plants in order to lock in some of that moisture down on the ground. Now, in a bed next to my garlic, I also have my overwintered onions, and we've got quite a few varieties again that have planted in there, but only one variety actually went in the ground over winter. The rest I planted the sets in my root trainers back in my greenhouse at home, and they have actually been growing quite well at home, but I want to get them in the ground as soon as possible. So I brought a load of those down and I've planted those into the ground. I've got to say I was quite impressed with how well the root trainers have worked, but more importantly, now they are in the ground, they should hopefully go on to continue to grow. Normally I would plant all my sets in the ground at the same time and get them all planted up in one go, but it does look like actually growing these in root trainers in the greenhouse with a bit more protection does look like it produces better plants. The ultimate thing we will find out is what happens towards the second half of the year when we actually harvest these and see how well these onions turn out. Time will tell whether it makes any difference. Now, one of the other things that have happened down on the allotment, as I've popped down here this week, I happened to bump into our council representative. He works for the council, but he looks after the allotments. And I've got to know this chap quite well over the last few years that he's taken on the allotments. And I was having a chat with him and finding out a bit more what's going on. Now, as you know, last year I contacted him about issues I was having where somebody stole my raised beds and I found knives on the allotment. So we've built quite a good rapport with that. But I also mentioned about my neighbours last year who hadn't attended their allotment, and he's actually evicted them come the end of the year, as well as somebody else that is near my allotment at the other side of the road. So basically at the moment, I have got an entire row, 2 rows actually, of allotments that are abandoned near me. I've got my full-size allotment, 128 and 128B, 122A and 122B, 121A and 121B, and 127A, B and C are all empty. That's quite a bit around me actually, looking at it. I didn't realise it. They've all got these signs up saying basically that they have been evicted because they haven't tended to their allotments at all. And I have to admit, they are a mess. There's bits of polytunnel just left hanging around, tyres on top of roofs just left hanging around. And I haven't seen any of these allotment holders over the last year on their allotment at all. So the fact that there are effectively 4 full-size allotments near me going available is quite worrying. But my council representative does tell me there's a lot of people on the waiting list to get an allotment. So hopefully that's going to be taken on. They've just got to get here and throw everything in a skip, which seems a bit of a shame to me because there's a lot of good stuff on both of these allotments. They are in pretty bad care, don't get me wrong, but there's a full greenhouse, lost all its glass, but the greenhouse frame is on one of these allotments. There's chairs, pots, water butts, all that are going to end up in the skip, which is a shame. And that's only because the council cannot do much more to try and get rid of it. It's a very difficult situation they find themselves in. It's a shame they can't donate it to charity or anything, but I think from their perspective there's too much paperwork involved and it is very, very difficult. Plus, technically, I guess they don't own it. So it's a lot going on the allotment at the moment. I think as now we're into spring, we are going to start getting really, really much busier on the allotment, and I think there's going to be a lot more happening down on the allotment. Right, with that, I think it's time to head back to the kitchen garden. Well, I'm just going to interrupt this podcast and ask, if you are enjoying this podcast, then please do rate and review on your podcast provider. It only takes you a few seconds. I know I say this every week, but it really does help us out. It helps us get found by more people who might also be interested in growing their own food. It gets the algorithms working, which means we get found much easier. Added to that, if you are enjoying this podcast, you want to help continue keep this podcast running, then please consider becoming a member of our supporters club. For just £5 a month, you get access to extra behind-the-scenes podcasts that give you a bit of an idea of what's going on here at the Veg Grower Podcast HQ. But added to that, once a month, you also receive our seed pack, and this comes through the post once a month. In that seed pack, you get a collection of seeds that can be sown in that very month, and you also get a copy of our mini newspaper. Personally, I think for £5, it's an absolute bargain, but most of all, it helps keep this podcast running. As an example of what we have sown over the last week, we've been sowing some tomato seeds, which of course are our seed of the month, and we've been sowing some carrot seeds, which, we all like carrots. We do like to eat some carrots, and they are a great thing to grow. Now, if that sounds like something you would be interested in, then please do head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk to find out more and sign up. We'd love to have you there. Well, I'm back at home and actually in my greenhouse here at home, because I've been doing quite a bit of work in this greenhouse over this last week. Now, first of all, a lot of this week we have been really sowing more seeds and potting up a lot of plants. This is still going on inside my kitchen. Most mornings I sit at the kitchen table, I'll pot on a few seeds, usually by setting myself up the night before. I'll sow a few seeds, also setting myself up the night before. And this is forming part of our production line. We've got chilies, aubergines, peppers, tomatoes, onions, shallots, courgettes, corn salad, rhubarb, asparagus, all indoors. And what we're realising is that indoors is rapidly out of space. I mean, I've mentioned this a lot over the last few weeks. Both our window sills that are suitable are full up of plants. Our kitchen worktop full up of plants, and even on our kitchen table, and that's not forgetting my shelf systems that I also use. It isn't an easy position to find myself in. My wife is incredibly tolerant because she does like a tidy house, and having all these plants and seedlings everywhere is, not very fair on her, I have to be honest. I think the fact I've spoken about having a new shed with a greenhouse, this needs to happen sooner rather than later, but it's not going to happen just yet. However, what I have realised is that outdoors in our grow house and our greenhouse, our plants that I've moved out there are surviving. Now, I expected this with plants like our brassicas, our cauliflowers, broccoli. I expected those to be okay outside. What I was more worried about would be plants like our tomatoes and our chilies. And a couple of weeks ago, I moved a couple out to our grow house. They seemed to survive, so I moved more out there. I then moved some into this greenhouse last week, and they have also survived. So what this told me is that it is now time to plant up my auto pot system and actually get this greenhouse starting to produce food for me. Now, down towards the front of my greenhouse, I have got the 2-pot system in which we have 6 pots. 2 pots being a smaller system. Now, if you don't know what the auto pot system is, basically it's a irrigation system. We have a water reservoir that connects to some trays. These trays have pots in them with plants planted in them, and it means that they are constantly watered, and we add feed to the water to grow the plants on. I tried this for the first time last year, and we had such great results. I'm expanding on the system in that we've got 6 smaller pots down one side of the greenhouse, and then along the back we got 4 larger pots. But these 6 smaller pots, today we have planted them up. So in one pot I have a strawberry plant I actually planted a few weeks ago, and that seems to be growing quite healthily. We are seeing flowers on it now, so hopefully that will lead to getting some early strawberries. Would be nice to be able to grow lots of strawberries actually. But into the other 5 pots. Today I've planted up 2 aubergines, 1 in each pot, a chili pepper, this is a habanero chili, a sweet pepper and a tomato mini bell. And all I've done is I've filled up these pots with a mix of compost and perlite, placed them into their respective trays, pot a plant into them with a label of course, and then all we got to do is sit back and watch these plants grow. Hopefully we'll start to see results pretty soon. We found it really good last year, so I'm expecting good results this year. What I'm really happy about though is the fact that these plants are in the greenhouse and seems to be coping quite well. This means that this greenhouse now is turned into its production. It is becoming useful for growing food. I've often spoke about how I want the greenhouse to be there for grown food, not for seedlings, just because I find it's too easy to fill up with seedlings. But having these 6 plants now growing in here should hopefully lead to some early chilies, early tomatoes, early aubergines, if we get aubergines at all. What I've learned over the years, I do get a few aubergines every year, but they are one of those plants that a lot of people do struggle with. And what I've learned is they need very similar conditions to chilies. They need a long growing period, but they also need a sunny, warm, ideally self-facing wall or something like that in order to produce a decent crop. And this is something that I've learned with conversations with other people. So having aubergines in a greenhouse should prove well, but also we're going to try and get these outside later on in the year against a self-facing wall in order to try and produce some good plants. Now ideally we would have the 4 pots along the back planted up as well, but our plants for there are just not quite ready. We're going to have a couple of tomato plants in here, a cucumber and a melon, and they're just not quite there. They're not far off being ready, but they're just not quite there, so we're just holding back and waiting. However, in this greenhouse I do have a lovely peach tree. This is a peach tree in a pot. It's in a pot because I like to move the peach tree into this greenhouse over winter to shelter it from rain, because that rain can lead to peach leaf curl. Well, this peach tree has been flowering, and this is one of those things that I expected around this time, but there's not many pollinators around. So what I have to do, because it is flowering early for pollinators, I have to act like a bee, and I go around with a little paintbrush and just go visit every flower and try and self-pollinate it. This hopefully will lead us to getting some decent peaches from this tree in a little bit later on in the year. Come May, we can start moving this tree outside. That's when the risk of peach leaf curl has been passed. But I find just moving this tree into over winter pays off. Added to that, I've been talking a lot about the signs that spring is here. Our rhubarb plant it's one of the older ones that we're probably going to remove at some point in the not too distant future. That has put on loads of growth, starting to show that we'll soon be harvesting rhubarb from that, which I'm really pleased about, because just in front of this greenhouse is that plant and another rhubarb plant. Last year, however, I did make a new rhubarb bed, and that I planted up with 2 rhubarb plants as well. They are showing signs of growth as well, so that means that we do think we're going to be successful with rhubarb this year, and especially with our new bed, which is great. It's exactly what we wanted. It means that when I get rid of this rhubarb bed in front of the greenhouse, we do have more rhubarb growing on elsewhere. Added to that, rhubarb that I've got growing in pots in various locations that we've sown from seed over the last few years, they have all started to grow as well. So we are really making a lot of progress at the moment. We've seen food growing here. Definitely a lot coming up. Asparagus is also starting to show its head, so soon we're going to have to start building our new asparagus bed. But it's all very exciting, and it's all moving in a way that we hope. Let's just hope the weather doesn't suddenly dip. fingers crossed for that. Right, I think it's time to find out what Chef Scott has for us this week. And then I'll meet you back in the podding shed.
Chopping all the veggies, sizzle in the air. Chef Scott with the magic, smells are everywhere. Water starts to boil, onions hit the pan. Recipe of the week, let the feast begin. Cooking with Chef Scott, flavors come alive. Tune in every week for a tasty bite.
Hi, it's Scott here with this week's recipe. And this week we have spring vegetable air fryer phyllo parcels. They're a little bit like spanakopita, but individual parcels stuffed with whatever you have growing at the allotment or in the garden, and mixed with ricotta, mozzarella and parmesan, and eaten hot or cold. They are great for packed lunches and beat the boring old sandwich any day. I put peas, broad beans, courgettes and asparagus in mine, but just use whatever you have growing. Just herbs and the cheese mix works great. Just use the same ratio of cheese mix to vegetables or herbs. And if you want to get a little bit fancy, a drizzle of chili-infused honey works fantastic with them. So, let's head to the kitchen and hear how they're made. As usual, you can find this recipe and others on the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk and on my Instagram page, Seed to Table, Plot 13. This recipe will make 12 parcels, depending on the size you make them. And if you can't eat them all in one sitting, they freeze well, or just half the recipe. For this recipe, you will need 250 grams of ricotta, 125 grams of small diced fresh mozzarella, 50 grams of grated parmesan, 80 grams of small diced asparagus, 50 grams of small diced runner beans, 40 grams of small diced courgettes, 80 grams of peas, 80 grams of broad beans, and 2 sliced spring onions, and salt and pepper to taste. Method. In a pan of rapidly boiling water, blanch the diced vegetables for 1 minute, then drain under cold water to chill. Now mix the vegetables with the cheeses and season with salt and pepper. Now using 4 layers of phyllo pastry, make little parcels with a spoon of filling in each parcel. You can make triangle samosa shapes or any shape you like or feel comfortable with making. Now brush with butter and cook in an air fryer at 190 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes, turning over halfway through. Then allow to cool. And that's the recipe done. And that's it from me this week.
Well, once again, another delicious recipe from Chef Scott there. Each week he just makes me hungrier and hungrier. So thank you to Chef Scott for that. And as always, please do let us know if you have tried any of these recipes. They're always good to find out how well they are being received. I want to talk to you today about a few other methods of propagation. We've spoken a lot about sowing seeds in the last few weeks, and I think that is probably the one way that we grow lots of different vegetable plants is by growing them from seeds. And we do this repeatedly every year, be it our annuals or even some of our perennial plants. But sowing seeds is not necessarily the easiest way. I say that because sowing seeds, I always feel that you do need specialist equipment. You need seed compost, you need heat, you need the right conditions ideally for your seed to germinate. And often I hear of people who are finding that their seeds are not germinating. And it could be for very good reasons. Old, out-of-date seeds could be one reason, or just not getting the conditions just right. Every single seed has different conditions. But what I often find is that there are other ways of growing some plants from seed. And some of these are really interesting to do, and some are what we can do right now. Now, in particular, the one that I'm thinking of is softwood cuttings. This is something that I do try to do quite regularly. Things like rosemary, thyme, which we can grow from seed, but we very, very rarely do. Instead, we would take cuttings from these plants in order to try and get more plants from them. Now, because we are entering spring, this is when we're going to get some softwood cuttings, which is that fresh, new growth, and that is what's known as softwood. And you can normally tell it's softwood because it looks new, it looks fresh, it's normally quite flexible. We would want to use that, and we would just snip it off, trying to get a 45-degree angle on the cut. Remove a few of the lower leaves, dip the cutting in some rooting hormone, and then place that in a pot of compost. Place a plastic bag or a lid over the pot to keep the humidity up, and that means that most of our softwood cuttings will take and start to root. I've had so much success for that. It's worked so well for so many plants, especially rosemary. You can get a lot of plants for next to no money by doing this. One of the other methods that we have, which there is still time to do, is root cuttings. Now, this usually works with some of the fleshy roots, such as rhubarb, comfrey, ginger, and this is just simply by digging up the plant, cutting that root, and replanting all the individual pieces that we've cut into their own pots and seeing what germinates. It really is that quite easy. I've done this very successfully with a wide range of plants, be it our rhubarb plants, our ginger plants, our comfrey plants. But one of my ultimately favourite ways, and this is something I've spoken about a lot in the past, is layering. Now, layering is something that actually happens in nature, and I like to replicate nature as much as I possibly can. So in nature, something like strawberries or blackberries, they will pop their stems out, they will grow, and then when the stem comes in contact with the ground over winter or over a period of time, it will start to root at that point. So if you think of runners from strawberries, where that strawberry plant is, it's in contact with the ground, it starts to root there. And it's the same with blackberries. Often they pop their stems out, it drops down in contact with the ground, and it starts to root, giving a whole new plant. But again, this can be replicated with many other plants. Currants, gooseberries, to name a few. Now, what I like to do when it comes to trying to layer these plants is I take that young, fresh, new year growth, new season growth, and pop that through the bottom of a plant pot. Now, we do have to try and secure the plant pot in some way, maybe through a cane and tie it to the cane, or maybe to the mother plant itself. I will then let that grow for a couple of weeks to make sure it is actually growing through the pot before filling up that pot with compost. Again, making sure that pot is secured. Then leave it until autumn. We cut away below that plant pot, and often you will find that you have got a whole new plant. It is layered, it is rooted inside that plastic plant pot. This is a really good way, I find, of growing more plants, and I actually find layering to be much more successful than taking cuttings or even taking seeds in some places. Now, I highly recommend that you do give this a try if you are looking at amplifying the amount of plants you have. You might have a red currant bush that you want more of. Try and look at layering. It really, really is easy, and it really is simple. There is a simpler way than passing it through a pot, of course, and that's just simply taking a branch, stapling that branch to the ground, and waiting for that to root there. Really easy, and it'll soon take. Well, that brings us up to the end of this week's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, then please do leave a rate and review on your podcast provider. We have had a few ratings come in, but no reviews to share with you this week. If you want to support this podcast, then please consider becoming a member of our supporters club, which you can find at theveggrowpodcast.co.uk. Now, also on our website, you can also get in touch by leaving a comment, leaving an email, or even leaving a voicemail, which we always do like to hear the voicemails. We haven't had any for a while, but they are always good to hear back on the voicemail. Or you can also email me, richard@veggrowpodcast.co.uk. And of course, you can find us on social media. I'm on pretty much every platform, and it's always good to hear back from listeners on social media too. We also do have the Facebook group as well, if you do want to chat with other like-minded gardeners. Well, with that brings us up to the end of this week's podcast. We will be back again next time, so until then, please take care.